Imperial Yeast has been up to some interesting things lately, and they recently announced a product we are super excited about. If you're familiar with Imperial Yeast, you're likely aware of their classification system. A is for ale as an A07 flagship, L is for lager as an L17 harvest, and so on. Well, they recently released the first strain in their I series, which stands for Imperialis and refers to non-GMO hybrids or derivative yeast strains developed by Imperial Yeast that have been honed to exhibit the traits today's brewers most desire. The initial offering, I-22 Capri, is a hybrid of A38 Juice and A43 Loki, two of Imperial's most popular strains for hop-forward IPA. Whether you're into this style or just enjoy juicier fermentation characteristics, you have got to try I-22 Capri. Learn more about the Imperialis project and I-22 Capri at imperialyeast.com. A few years ago, I noticed an interesting trend while editing the articles we publish on Brülosophy.com. More often than not, the very first sentence, regardless of the author of the article, was something along the lines of, "Back when I first started homebrewing." I joked about this with the crew, which not only led to our concerted effort not to start articles that way anymore, but it also made us very aware that a lot of people seem to do this. To me, this is just a sign of the seemingly natural urge among us humans to kind of be comparative, to relate where one is at today with where they were before. Well, that's exactly what we're going to be doing very intentionally in this episode today. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me to discuss our experiences brewing in the modern age compared to what it was like in the past, I suppose, is contributor Jordan Folks.
This actually was inspired by a Reddit article I saw, or a Reddit thread, where someone was like, "Hey, I'm getting back into the hobby after 10 years of being totally out of it. What's changed?" And sitting there, I was like, oh my gosh, everything. And I've been brewing for over 10 years and have come along this journey from the DIY era to, brew in a box at this point, and a lot's changed, and I think there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And look, I get that the term modern age is kind of a weird one to use here. Coming up with descriptive titles, I'll be honest, isn't always that easy, all right? So that's the only reason we went with modern age, is because we're talking about today compared to 10 to 20 years ago, which is the time span that you and I have been brewing, Jordan. Like you said, the inspiration for this experience topic actually did come from a Reddit post in the homebrewing subreddit, where somebody mentioned that they were getting back into homebrewing after like 5 or 10 years, something like that. And they did ask what has changed. So, Jordan and I were kind of pondering this ourselves and thought it would make for a good episode topic. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be talking about how things today, for us at least, in our brewing, and there are a lot of things, how they differ from when it was when we first started. So it's going to be a nice little trip down memory lane, I believe. So if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up in February of 2024, Dana Garvis, founder of Oregon Brew Lab, will be hanging out with patrons. In addition to being an accomplished homebrewer, Dana is a trained brewing chemist who helped build the quality control lab at Ninkasi Brewing Company before starting her own company in 2016. Oregon Brew Lab offers a variety of essential analyses for affordable prices to both commercial and homebrewers. We've had the pleasure of working with Oregon Brew Lab many times over the years, and we will certainly be doing it more in the future. Dana is truly an incredible member of the brewing community. I'm really looking forward to this session, and I'm sure you would enjoy it just as much. If you want to be a part of it, please make sure to make your pledge of $3 or more by Friday, February 23rd, 2024, as Dana's going to be taking those questions on Saturday, the 24th. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook and Patreon pages, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brülosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we would really appreciate that. Thanks so much to everybody who's already taken the 2 minutes to do this. Again, we read every single one of those bits of feedback. All right, feedback for this episode is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are legit, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You will not be disappointed with one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run an amazing YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you are in the market for electric brewing gear, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and do not forget to let them know that Brülosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Okay, since dropping the last Average Brew American Porter episode last week, we have received a few emails from folks whose beers that were reviewed, but we didn't really know who it was that sent them in, or we got something else off about them. And since they all took the time and effort to send us those beers, I thought it only fair to give them all some credit, starting with Michael Sharps, who replied to an email he'd sent me about 2 weeks prior to the episode going live with, quote, "Here are the details from the canned beer." If you recall, there was one beer that we had no information on except, well, I actually did have some details. It was sitting in my inbox buried under a bunch of other emails that I had received. Now, Michael noted he forgot to include the note with his beers and was encouraged by the Brew Club leadership to email them to me. So I do take full responsibility for overlooking that. That is my bad, Michael. I will not read the whole thing, but he said he used oven toasted coconut, vanilla bean, and coffee from Unknown Entity. I believe that's a coffee roaster local to him, to impart a cocoa flavor to the porter. Yum, yum, yum. That beer was delicious. I'm not the biggest fan of adjunct-laden beers, but there's just something about coconut in porter that I absolutely love. What about you, Jordan?
I really like it, but man, I don't feel super confident in doing it at home. Have you done it much at home?
I have actually never brewed with coconut, but I have a couple of friends who, over a decade now ago, were making coconut porters that tasted like Almond Joy. I mean, phenomenal. And I don't think it's that difficult. I do believe that there is some benefit to home toasting it, which it sounds like Michael did, just to kind of like, I don't know, add that nutty character as opposed to just this sweet raw coconut flavor. But yeah, I've never done it personally, but the ones that I've had that were homebrewed have been phenomenal.
Yeah, I love a good coconut beer, but it does run the risk of going rancid. And the one time I did it, it eventually turned, and it was truly a nightmare. And a couple of bottles had actually gone out as gifts, and I was like, "Do not open it! It has gone bad." I've never had a beer go bad like that.
That's so weird. Yeah, because of the oils in coconut, right? I mean, that's what would cause that.
Presumably, yeah. And they say that that's why you home toast it, to kind of get some of that oil out and maybe pat it with a paper towel.
Sure.
And it was really great when it was fresh, but woo, it did not last forever.
Oh, that's a bummer. A good coconut porter, though, I'm telling you. I mean, I've had coconut in paler beers. It tastes okay, but there's just something about that roast and the coconut. So, Michael, thank you so much for sending the beers in and for updating me on my failure to, adequately print out the notes that you sent me on that. Next the next email came from Hava Murillo, who happens to serve on the Brew Club leadership team and is responsible for a bunch of the really rad graphics associated with the club. He said, "I was the one with the unreadable notes, Stargazer Brewery. Haha, cheers. Great episode like always." Well, Havo, thank you so much for sending your delicious beer. Again, another phenomenal. There wasn't a bad one in the bunch for that Average Brew review, but even more for putting up with our attempts to read your beautiful script. We were not trying to make fun. I believe you trust that. It's just that we haven't seen cursive handwriting so beautiful in a long time. It's difficult to interpret, if you will. That honestly made me feel like an idiot. Anyway, your beer was excellent, and the story you told about your father has definitely stuck with all of us. Jordan, I'm not sure if you recall this one, but Havo, I believe he mentioned something about brewing that beer in some way in sort of honor of his father who recently died. And I love that kind of stuff. Our heartfelt condolences to you, Havo.
Totally. I love how brewing can be such a meaningful kind of social and communal event. I actually read just yesterday about English October beer, and apparently they would brew it like in celebration of the birth of the firstborn son, and they wouldn't tap it until he turned, I think, 18 or something like that. I heard that story many, many years ago and haven't thought about it until you just brought it up. Yeah, I think it's such a cool thing. And I know a lot of people who do that. Brewing from the outside looking in, it looks like a bunch of nerds just kind of geeking out on something that makes them feel kind of good after having a few drinks. But there's this weird drive I feel like a lot of us have to make it more meaningful than that. And the number of beers that I've had that are celebrating, for example, the birth of a child, or again, the death of a loved one or something like that. It was just last summer
summer that we published Steve's article on, the beer that he brewed with a friend of his who was terminally ill at the time of brewing it with him. I mean, that kind of stuff is just so rad. And it's one of the things I love so much about this hobby. So final comment comes from Tim Marks, who said, let's see, you might remember him, better recognize him as the guy who had the Dad Bod Beer Company stickers and such that he sent us. His porter, we were convinced it had coffee in it. And so he shot me the following email after hearing us talk about how coffee-like this beer was. He said, my average brew porter has 0 coffee in it, just 3 pounds of British brown malt, which gives that amazing coffee aroma and flavor. He says, my secret is out. So thank you for the clarification there, Tim. It's wild how much coffee we all got from your beer. I think all 4 of us were on board with, he must have snuck in some coffee in here. And I am shocked that it was just from brown malt. I picked up like 5 pounds of brown malt during a trip to More Beer, I don't know, 10, 11 years ago. Used it a couple of times and never went back to it because I just wasn't a fan of what it contributed to the beers I made with it, which were all kind of classic British bitter type beers. Apparently it works different in darker styles, or you just brew better than me, Tim. What's your experience with brown malt, Jordan? Have you ever used it? Are you a fan of it?
Well, in the spirit of going down a trip on memory lane, it has been a really long time. I recall the homebrew store had extra brown malt and extra amber malt, and they let everyone in the homebrew club take, a few pounds home for free. And I was a very new brewer and didn't know what the heck to do with that stuff. And I think I made an American brown ale, and I probably used way too much brown malt. So I know that that's one ingredient that's, maybe one of the most notorious malts in terms of like people being afraid of overuse or even using it at all. But they say that it is a key to a classic English porter. Granted, I think they also say that they don't really make brown malt like they did in the, colonial times either. So that's definitely a bit of a mysterious ingredient to me.
Yeah. So I have never used amber malt. When I started brewing, and we're going to get into this whole topic here in a bit in the next segment, but when I started brewing, the amber malt was like, oh, don't use that. You can use these different crystal malts along with base malt. You're going to get a better character. So that has kind of stuck with me, I guess. I learned all that stuff that you mentioned about brown malt only after using it. You learn from experience, and I overused it. Sounds like you might have as well, Jordan. I'll tell you right now, Tim Marks did not overuse it. It tasted like coffee, and it was not like a hint of coffee. It tasted like you were drinking a coffee porter. It was phenomenal. The fact there's no coffee in it, pretty rad stuff. Tim, thank you so much for sending us in the beer and for updating us on how you made it. It was great. And so thank all of you guys, all 3 of you for all the information, for sending us the beers. And thanks to the Brew Club for allowing us to do this kind of thing every quarter. It's really a lot of fun. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brulosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. So we have made it to the 1-year mark since dropping the first episode of the Brülosophy show, and things couldn't be going better. We had a goal of cracking 20,000 subscribers in our first year, and we just passed that last week. So huge thanks to everybody who made their way over to youtube.com/@the Brülosophy show and tapped that subscribe button. I believe you're supposed to say smashed that subscribe button, something like that, but we really do appreciate you. As some may recall, we dropped from our weekly publishing schedule to bi-monthly, every other week about halfway through the year. But given the positive response to the Brülosophy show, Martin has been highly motivated to be that crazy guy again who is dropping weekly episodes, which we know, we've had many fans ask for it. So that is going to be happening starting this month, February of 2024. We're moving back to weekly episodes. And let me just say that the stuff Martin has come up with is pretty freaking rad. If you haven't already, go check out the Brülosophy show on YouTube. We're sure you're going to love it. Time for a quick break. When we return, we're going to be discussing our experiences brewing in the modern age.
Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the exGEERience Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brülosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the exGEERience Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every exGEERience comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exGEERience.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
When I first got into brewing back in 2003, see, there it is again. It's so easy to start off a segment or a paragraph in an article with that silly little statement. I'm sure there are some listeners who would say they know very well what Marshall's brewing history is because of how many times that I've made that statement. And if we were to play a trivia game, you could probably say some things like what styles I've never brewed, the types of beers that you think I love and hate, all that stuff. Well, we are going to talk about all of that stuff in this episode, comparing the methods we use now with how we used to brew in the past, and thoughts about things, and the way things have changed over the years, the way this hobby for us personally in our own personal experiences have evolved from, again, the way we used to do things to the way we're doing them now. I'm thinking it might be easiest or at least partially more organized, maybe to start at the beginning of the brewing process and then proceed in a sort of temporal fashion. What do you think, Jordan? The first thing that comes to my mind that has changed massively, at least in the way that I think about things, is water quality. And to me, that's kind of the first thing we think about when it comes to brewing a batch of beer.
Well, back in my day, I remember they always used to say, if it tastes good, it brews good, right? And not only was just the baseline water quality of much lesser concern, but also our willingness to manipulate it. It was like, oh, water chemistry, that's really advanced. Homebrewers, we don't mess around with that. As long as it tastes good, it makes good beer. I mean, the water book didn't even come out until I had been brewing for a few years.
Oh yeah.
So it was a bit of a Wild West back when we first started. And I guess I should clarify, I started in 2011 and the water book probably came out in 2012 or 2013. So what was water chemistry adjustments like in 2003, Marshall?
So I've told the story before. I'm not going to belabor that point, but when I started brewing, it was like, I think it was in April. It was still cold outside. I know that, and it wasn't winter. We were coming out of winter. So I think it was like, March or April up in Bellingham, Washington of 2003. And when I went down to the homebrew store, you could tell the staff in there, it was just two dudes usually. This one guy, Mars, though, is the one I clicked the most with. And you could tell they kind of evaluate where you're at and the way that you ask questions, and then they'll make recommendations kind of based on that. And he pretty immediately was like, dude, you need to do all grain. You got to buy this 3-tier setup, yada, yada. And then you could just use water out of the tap. We have good water here in Bellingham. And I never thought about it. He's like, if you really want to make like an IPA, you can buy this bag of white powder and just add it to your water, but you don't need that. That's something you don't need to worry too much about. I mean, I spent the better part, to this day, I would say that the majority of my home brewing in terms of water has been with that mindset that, the whole saying of if it tastes good enough to drink, then it's good enough to brew beer with. That is not what I believe today. And we have a lot of people to thank for that. I think most notably Martin Brungard with the Brew and Water spreadsheet. This is a guy who realized, a while ago that water is incredibly important. So he created this incredibly easy to use spreadsheet. It looks intimidating, but don't let those looks deter you. It's quite easy to use. That allows people to make adjustments to their water, presuming that it's decent water, to really bring out the character of the styles of beers that they're making. And that changed my whole world. And then we started doing our experiments, and then we started reading the water book and, talking to Palmer about all of this stuff. And Colin Kaminsky, of course, we can't, co-author of the water book with John Palmer. I just think that the way that people look at water today feels, at least to me, and I know that for me personally, is just so 180 degrees different.
What do you think the market share for Burton salts is at this point?
That's a good question. I actually did, that was what it was, right? The Burton salts in the baggie.
Yeah.
And for those, I guarantee you there are listeners who are like, what the hell are these guys talking about? Burton salts were just a blend of, I think it was mostly just gypsum because they were such high sulfate, Burton on Trent water, where IPA was purported to be, kind of invented. Very, very hard water, high in sulfates, which makes a great IPA. We know that. But I think most people now recognize that buying in bulk, your chloride, your calcium chloride, your sodium or your calcium sulfate, which is gypsum, maybe even some Epsom salt or whatever else it might be, is just easier because making those adjustments takes zero time. You do it while your water's coming up to, temp. So I have to imagine that homebrew shops aren't selling much prepackaged Burton salts these days.
Right. And the other thing is it all depends on your baseline. And so if you're starting with RO or something, then we could all in theory be using the same prepackaged mineral blends. But another one that they had was 5.2.
Oh, God.
And you would add that to your mash, and then magically any mash would become 5.2 pH. And it's things like that. It was kind of like a Band-Aid approach for the technology and the understanding in the market at the time. And wow, I mean, now people are, first-time homebrewers are advanced water chemists at this point. It's amazing how far both the hobby has come and also kind of like the hobbyist willingness to dive deep.
Yeah. So that 5.2 stuff, you better believe I bought some. I think it was back in like 2011. I picked up a thing of it, and it was very soon after that, as I'm talking to other brewers where they're like, yeah, that stuff's BS. It doesn't do much. And sure enough, tester that I am, I started doing some comparisons. It had a bit of a buffering effect, I guess, is what people were saying, but it wasn't worth the money. I'd rather just kind of take care of that stuff myself because, again, it really isn't that difficult. You don't need a Band-Aid for something that's such a shallow cut, if you will. What kind of water do you start with now? And have you adapted since you started brewing?
Yeah, so I run it through a standard, $20 RV filter that you just screw onto your hose. I do use a Flexzilla brand hose. It's BPA-free, drinking water quality hose. I had a friend got burned by a really cheap hose that made his beers taste like plastic. He brewed two before he figured it out.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, so I just run it through a simple filter, and I only incorporated that maybe halfway into my brewing because here in Portland, Oregon, we just have really pristine water, and you probably really don't need to. At least where I've lived in the specific houses, I was making great beer without it. But now it's just a bit of insurance. But I've never dealt with Camden tablets or any sort of thing like that. That was something that people talked about back in, the 2010s, was making sure that you were dropping out any like Band-Aid flavors, et cetera, via like a Camden tablet. But the actual mineral adjustment was a little advanced at that time.
Yeah. This will be my last point on the water quality thing because we've got so many other topics to hit on here. But when I first started, it was water out of my sink. And so there was no water hose, and I never had to worry about the green water hose flavor. When we talk about bad flavors from water, the water hose thing is distinct from the chlorine/chloramine Band-Aid character that we talk about. If you've ever tasted water out of a green water hose, when you have a beer where somebody made it with water from one of those. It tastes exactly the same, just with beer on top of it. It's nasty. Don't use those hoses. Get a potable water hose. They're just as cheap, and they last longer in my experience, and they don't impact the flavor of the water. So my evolution on this one is sort of a lily pad type of thing. So I was using unfiltered regular old tap water from my sink up in Bellingham. Moved down to Fresno here in California, and I start brewing here. Things are going well. You start brewing those first few batches, and you're excited by it, and then you're like, well, there's something I want to change. What can that be? And so I bought, like you have, an RV filter, and started doing that, and it worked out. I even moved into the RO filter for a while, and that worked even better, but it was a pain in the ass. Took forever to get water. And, with as much as we brew, it was very difficult for me. So I moved back to the RV filter, and I had my local friends were like, your beers are great, but they have this very distinct house flavor. Well, I didn't want a house flavor. And so I started kind of troubleshooting and trying these different tweaks. And finally, no joke, I think it was Jake, actually, ex-contributor of Brülosophy, was like, just try using some Campton. Put a little potassium metabisulfite in your water, very, very small amount before you brew with it, and see if that changes it. And sure enough, that house flavor was completely gone. So the only thing that we could come to was that there must have just been enough chlorine in my water to contribute it wasn't Band-Aidy, it wasn't that bad, but contribute this weird uniqueness that I wasn't a big fan of. And so now that I'm using filtered water that I treat with just a little pinch of PMB, I'm all in the clear, and the beers are basically, what I aim for when I'm designing the recipes. So that is my evolution over time with the water quality stuff. I do feel like that's such a huge component that got poo-pooed for so long. And it's nice to see even some of the guys who get the finger pointed at them for making it less of a big deal than it was in the early days are now coming back and saying, no, we didn't mean it like that. We were just saying that you've got a lot of other stuff to deal with before you dig into the chemistry side of water. So now that it has been made so easy by the likes of Martin Brungard and John Palmer, everybody can do it, and we highly encourage that you do. What about mashing, Jordan? Let's talk a little bit about how things have changed in our perspective in terms of mashing your grains.
Well, I think one of the reasons that they didn't recommend beginning homebrewers to mess around with water is that beginning homebrewers tended to use extract. And legend has it that extract's already been adjusted. You don't have to do anything. That's probably bogus as well. But back in the day, you wanted to try homebrewing, you brewed on your stovetop with a big jar of liquid malt extract, maybe some dry malt extract, and maybe some steeping grains. But that was really the name of the game for beginning homebrewers at the very least. And back then, a lot of people didn't even necessarily graduate. They were totally content with partial mashing, as we called it. I've even heard the phrase partial mash in a while, It seems that now in 2024, that is just really, you start with all grain, and you might even buy an electronic system on day one. It's definitely become an all grains world.
Yeah. So this is where some opinions are going to come out for me. I started extract with steeping grains, or I never did a true partial mash. I guess there's a distinction because with a partial mash, you're steeping base grains to get some extraction along with the extract. I never did that. I did, all extract with specialty grains, crystal malt, stuff like that, just to get flavored. So you're using like a pale malt extract with these other specialty grains to create the style of beer that you want. One of the biggest changes was that back then, in 2003, and I'm curious to hear your actually what you think about this. I want to know how many batches you brewed using extract, but back in 2003, the first 9 batches of beer I made were extract with steeping grains. And it was widely accepted, at least in the local Bellingham homebrewing crew there, that liquid malt extract is far superior to that dry malt extract crap. And hence it was more expensive, but you could go at North Corner Brew Supply, where my homebrew shop at the time, you'd go in and you could pull from a huge blue barrel, the extract that you want in any color, and it was such a cool experience. The smell of liquid malt extract is something that I will never forget. I can smell it today and it still brings back fond memories, despite the fact that I can't stand the stuff nowadays. Not only is it messy, I don't necessarily love, I should say, the flavor that it contributes to beer. I'm a much bigger fan these days. If I'm brewing with extract, I'm going dry malt extract all day long.
Yeah, I definitely remember liquid malt extract was the default back when I started in 2011. And when I discovered dry malt extract, I switched because I found it easier to incorporate into the solution. And I don't necessarily recall there being a big controversy around which one you would choose, but it seemed like the homebrew stores were kind of pushing liquid malt extract. Whether there was a real reason behind that, I don't know.
Yeah. You know why I think they would push it? Now, this is just presumption on my part, is because liquid malt extract's shelf life is way lower than dry malt extract. Yeah, dry malt extract, if you open the bag and you have like a humid summer or something like that, it will harden up. I've received emails from people who have made their hard DME work, but normally you just toss it and buy another bag of the stuff. Liquid malt extract, it'll turn dark, it oxidizes crystallizes just like beer does. And it takes on a really odd metallic caramely flavor, even if it started off as a pale malt, pale LME. So not a fan of that stuff. The other changes that have happened though, when it comes to the mash step, just has to do with the method in which people are making their wort, their sweet wort. When I started, I'd never heard of anything other than fly sparging. And a big part of the reason that I avoided going from, extract to all grain was because I didn't have the room and I didn't want to invest the time, energy, and money into building a 3-vessel, miniature professional brewing system in my apartment. And when I got, when I start 2-3 years before starting Brülosophy, what ultimately got me motivated to go into all grain was the whole batch sparge movement, which is where, you are, rather than doing a continuous sparge where you're sprinkling your sparge water over the top of your grain bed and then slowly collecting your sweet wort out of your mash tun, you do one batch and then you run off all of that sweet wort, and then you pour in more water, and then you collect that second runnings, and then you proceed with your boil. And it worked beautifully for me. I've since changed to a different approach these days. But what was your experience? Did you start using fly sparge, or did I got about 10 years on you. So it sounds like around the time you were getting into homebrewing is when I was making that switch to batch sparge. So moving from extract to batch sparge.
Right. Yeah. So I maybe did 7 or so batches of partial mash or steeping grains approach, and then moved into all grain. And one big difference from now and then was the equipment access. Back then, you pretty much had to make your own mash and boil setup. There were starting to come out with some purpose-built mash systems, et cetera, but that was like way out of reach in terms of my grad students' ability to afford it. And also just like the idea of spending that kind of money on homebrewing was ridiculous at the time. How far we've come. But back then it was an igloo cooler, right?
Yeah.
And so I remember it was so annoying because you'd have to heat the water up in a pot. And then there were all these tricks surrounding like preheating your igloo cooler mash tun. And then like, if God forbid you forget to put the bazooka tube in it, then you have to somehow try to figure out how to separate the mash from the wort. That was a nightmare when that happened. But at the time, there were definitely fly sparge setups, and you could build your own or buy your own. But at this point, batch sparging was definitely socially acceptable, and so we went straight into batch sparging. It was super easy. But yeah, I remember trying to do like step mashes and stuff, and having to, they had online calculators for the step mashing in an igloo cooler where you could specify your temp, spots that you wanted to hit and like how much grain you had and how much water you had, and it would divvy up the water according to the step mash, and you were adding boiling water and hitting mash temperatures successfully. Even a single infusion back in the igloo era was such a point of stress, and was like kind of, I think, the origin of don't worry, relax of a homebrew, because we were always fretting over hitting our mash temps. And then like you throw the blanket on it and like, oh crap, it's too hot. You throw some cold water in it. It was a nightmare.
Oh my God. Which actually speaks to another thing we're going to talk about under this title here of the mash is mash temperature and the importance of hitting that square on, what you're aiming for. But yes, dude, I can so relate. And what I would do, I had this whole process and I had it down pat. I mean, I was brewing 2-3 batches a week. So, my experience kind of taught me on my system how best to hit the desired mash temp. But yeah, overheating, we used to say overheat your strike water, put it in the mash tun, use that. And I would overheat by 8 degrees Fahrenheit. That was it. If I did 8 degrees, that's what would warm my mash tun up. And then I could add the grains to the water. So I wasn't underletting. I wasn't adding the grains first and then stirring the water in. I was doing the opposite. And it would usually fall within about 0.5, no joke, about 0.5 degrees of my target strike temperature or mash temperature. And that was ideal. So, but man, what a pain in the butt that was. And then it was brew in a bag. And I will never forget, dude, when the brew in a bag thing kind of struck and it was all over the forums. We have our Australian homebrewing friends to thank for this idea. It was crapped upon something fierce. I mean, people were like, God, you're going to get awful, astringency from squeezing the bag. You're going to get poor conversion because it's a no sparge or a full volume mashing method. Most of the people that I know who brew today do some form of brew in a bag, whether they're using a stainless steel basket or a fabric bag. And the beers that people are producing, I think proof of the pudding is the award-winning beers that the brewer over at Crow and Wolf, Brad Gaines has made using this method. It is completely legit nowadays. I don't see anybody talking bad about it anymore, and that is just the shift in thinking about these different brewing methods. I think is fascinating.
I mean, sparging was part and parcel with homebrewing when we got started.
That's right.
And it's kind of no longer an issue. I mean, do we have a question on that in the survey? What proportion of the modern homebrewers are still sparging? I bet you it's really low, and it's thanks to brew in a bag and all-in-one systems.
Absolutely. And we do have a question about mash method. And yeah, we've been doing this survey, I think now, when we release the survey for 2024, I think it'll be our 8th year doing it, or 7th or 8th year. And yes, the trend is downward when it comes to actual continuous sparge methods. Batch sparge has shrunk massively, and now you're just seeing a ton of people doing some form of an all-in-one and or brew in a bag system at home. And I do think that the rise in the all-in-one system, which you and I love. I mean, I think all of Brülosophy now is brewing on one of these setups. I think that rise is because of, or at least in large part because of that acceptance of this method of adding grain to hot water, and which came from the whole brew in a bag thing. It used to be you put your grains in your mash tun, you add your water, you stir it all up, you do this continuous sparge thing. Now it is just far simpler. And again, I think that also speaks to why people are jumping right into all grain. The kind of controversial opinion, and I don't even know why this is controversial, but this opinion that I have that not everybody shares is I don't think people should start off using extract. In fact, I would contend that a lot of times when people do, the reason they quit homebrewing is because of how crappy those beers turn out. I am not saying you can't make a good extract beer, but take somebody who's never made a beer in their house before, walk them through all of the steps for making an extract with steeping grains. The jump to all grain is literally an inch. You don't have to do much more, and it might take a half an hour longer. And most of the time, I would contend they're going to be happier with the outcome. So this whole you got to cut your chops with extract first, I just don't get that argument. And I feel like it's a lot of people are coming at that from a sort of rite of passage, perspective. And I just think that's silly.
Yeah, but the only thing with all grain is there's a bit of an equipment cost, and you could brew an extract beer with basically no equipment. All you would need to get is the racking cane and the bottle capper, because everyone has a pasta pot in their kitchen, right? So that being said, I'm with you. If you can start with all grain, and I think brew in a bag is obviously one way. Make a 2-gallon batch or something on your stovetop. But there's a bit of a gestalt effect here because a new brewer is also, probably has an oxidized mess when they go in the package
yeah.
and is for under pitching and fermenting hot, and it's kind of a collection of not so great practices your first time. And so anything we can do to improve upon that on the first one is going to increase the likelihood that this is a hobby that actually sticks.
Which is why I argue for people just to jump into all grain. And I'll tell you what, the people that I recommended start with extract haven't brewed a beer in years. I haven't recommended this in years. Most of the people, not every single one of them, that I've walked through the process of starting with small batch all grain. So basically the same equipment that you would use for a 5-gallon batch of extract, you could get away with making a 2-gallon batch all grain beer. Almost all of those people are still brewing these days. So again, that is just anecdote. That's not science, but I do think it's interesting. So a couple of other points. We don't have to spend too much time on this because I feel like we talk about it often with the short and shoddy stuff, but it's our conception of the importance of mash length and mash temperature. If I don't hit the exact 154 degrees Fahrenheit that I'm aiming for, I don't sweat it these days. Same thing. If I need to mash for half an hour over 60 minutes, yeah, I might bump up the amount of grain I use by half a pound or a pound or something like that. But I'm now no longer convinced that by fudging on mash length and mash temperature that I'm going to somehow ruin the beer.
I remember adding ice cubes to the mash when I was like a degree high or something like that, you know? And now I definitely have embraced the Papazian philosophy of relaxing on mash temperature. And the other thing, remember, was worrying about mash temp decreases, temp losses.
Oh, yeah.
And so you'd put a heating pad around it and all that stuff. And it's just like, it's fine. It's really fine if it's a degree off.
Yeah, well, one thing I think we just need to get out there, because we have shown this over and over and over, is that mash temperature absolutely matters, right? It has an effect on the ultimate attenuation of your beer. If you mash warm, you're going to have less attenuation. If you mash nice and cool, down by 148 degrees Fahrenheit, you are going to have more attenuation. That absolutely will affect the alcohol by volume in the finished beer. Does it have a perceptible impact? We have not, time and time again, over multiple experiments, we have not been able to demonstrate that the FG, or finishing gravity, has any sort of a perceptible quality to it, which is crazy. Because for me, back in my day, if you finished a beer at 1018, boy, that's going to be a sweet mess. It depends on how it got that 1018. If it was because of mash temp, though, I'm not so convinced that that's going to be the case.
Well, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's got to be some level of threshold there. I'm sure that you would think that someone could taste the difference between a 0 Plato finishing gravity and like 20 Plato finishing gravity or something like that. But if we're, even a few points apart, like 4 standard gravity points, I mean, I've had several experiments that have had attenuation differences as a function of the variable. And gosh darn it, I cannot taste the difference of just a few gravity points. You would need a pretty large difference before you're starting to get really perceived sweetnesses in terms of a function of finishing gravity, at least in your ability to isolate the impact on your tongue.
Exactly. And I'm not saying that FG doesn't have some sort of a perceptible quality at all. What I'm saying is that the deltas that we have tested, so I think the average for us is about 10 specific gravity points difference. So you're looking at something like 1009 versus 1019. People can't taste that reliably. It's wild. And one of the data, we collected data for one of those experiments, the mash temp experiments, at a homebrew con. So a bunch of, arguably more astute palates, and they just could not tell it apart. Now, I will say that after a series of those experiments, we did go and look for, lab data. And sure enough, there is some science out there, real science, if you will, that suggests that the long chain dextrins that aren't getting fermented don't necessarily have a perceptibly sweet quality to them. So I think that's interesting. And it's something that we will, over the years, we're going to continue testing this out. I do think it'd be fun to really go to an extreme here and try to make like a 1005 versus a 1025 FG, same beer otherwise, and see if people can tell that apart. Because if not, I mean, that's an argument for the low alcohol crowd out there. Just increase your mash temp, which I know they already do. So in terms of boiling, there's not really much. Again, we've done a lot of experiments over here on boil length. We know that doesn't have much of a perceptible impact. And even when I was, in my earlier years of homebrewing, a lot of the talk about the boil was just isomerization of alpha acids. And then of course the DMS thing. But even 10, 15 years ago, the concerns of DMS weren't quite so strong. And today it just seems most people have accepted that, modern maltsters are processing the grains in such a way that DMS isn't as big of a concern. I don't know. Maybe your experience is different.
I think that when I first started, the rule was that when making lager beer or using Pilsner malts, which I guess we kind of missed that in the mash section, but like grain choice was like a lot different back then. You would never use Pilsner malt in a IPA. You would never use 2-row in a lager. And even then there's like a whole 6-row debate, like, a lager has to use 6-row. But anyways, but I recall that, if you use Pilsner malt, which was basically synonymous with making lager, you boiled it for 90 minutes. And now that was debunked even by 2015 or so from Brülosophy. And I think Martin Bruingard did an article in Zymergy maybe. Then they actually tested that and were finding that they were not, like lab data was showing that DMS levels were not a concern for most elevations and most grist, even Pilsner malt, for a 60-minute boil. But the other thing that's changed since then is the device that we use to boil it. Remember, back in the day, it was like in a keg. They called them kegels, and you like cut the top off of a commercial 15-gallon keg, and you had this like giant turkey burner that you would boil it on, and you had to do it outside in the backyard, and you'd run out of propane halfway through the brew day, and you have to run and get a new one. And man, I do not miss those days.
Yeah, man, I've made multiple kegels, in fact, and I did it the fair way. I would actually go to the distributors and ask them for their dented, kegs or whatever, and then I'd buy them from them, or I'd find them online from somebody who was selling them, who told me they were legal at least. What a pain in the ass. I mean, those things, making them first off is the fun part. Using them, I hated. You could barely fit your immersion chiller into the top. They were deep, really super deep. They were big and heavy and just a pain in the butt. But yeah, that you're right. The equipment that we use nowadays, I feel like we could just kind of, if we talk about our move into the whole all-in-one thing, that's what I would recommend. I get it. They're a little bit more costly, but man, the convenience is so worth it. I love it. But you're right. The boil length thing with the whole Pilsner malt, I absolutely, if I was using any amount of Pilsner malt, that wort got boiled for 90 minutes. I didn't care what anybody told me. It was only through our testing that I finally decided to stop doing that. It was actually one of those experiments that inspired the very first short and shoddy brew that I made. It was all Pilsner malt. And that's been amazing. We did one of the experiments that we did. Not only did we get the sensory data, our typical triangle test sensory data come back and say, nobody can tell this apart with any consistency. We ended up sending that beer into a university lab to have tested for DMS, and the DMS spikes were no different between a wort that was boiled for 30 minutes and one that was boiled for 90 minutes with, I believe, 100% Pilsner malt. So, again, your mileage may vary. Make of that what you will. I no longer boil wort for 90 minutes ever at all, unless I need to, because it's more convenient for some reason. Another interesting one, and this is one that I tested myself, was the whole, there's boil vigor. Does it have to be a really hard boil? Does it have to be a low boil? Back when I started, you had to boil that thing. Let it go. If you get a boil over, it's worth it because you need to boil it hard. We now know that that's not necessarily important. You can have just a little bit of rumble on the top of your wort and you should be fine. But the whole concept of covering your kettle, which again is the DMS argument that, that steam is going to collect on the top of your lid and drip back down into the wort, and you're not going to off-gas the dimethyl sulfide or the SMM or whatever. We've done an experiment where we kept the boil covered the entire time, and it was a good seal. It was a SS Brewtech kettle compared to one that was left open, and those beers were completely indistinguishable by anybody. So this whole idea of you can't boil with the lid on your kettle. Well, the nice thing about being able to do that is if you don't have a very strong burner or you're using a 120 volt element, you put the lid on there, it's going to come to a boil a lot faster. So, again, your mileage may vary.
Yeah. So I think the other thing on the hot side we could talk about is chilling. And in the spirit of like phrases I haven't heard in a decade, remember when people used to ask if you were a full volume brewer?
Yes, dude. That's so funny. And by that, it wasn't full volume mashing. They were talking about, are you boiling your entire volume of wort? Or are you doing a condensed version of that and then topping off with water? Remember topping up or topping off with water?
Yep.
Oh my gosh. I actually, when this goes way back, man. When the first 7 or 8 batches that I made, I wasn't asking for tips. I thought, man, I can go to the store and buy a bag of ice, a 20-pound bag of ice, and that melts down to right about 2 or 3 gallons of water, something like that. If I just pour that ice in my bucket, take my boiling wort, this condensed extract made wort, and pour it on that ice, it'll melt that ice real quick, and it drops it right down to about 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 C, and I can pitch my yeast. I did that for those first 7 or 8 batches that I made, and I never had an issue that I recall. So that was one way that I thought, man, I'm surprised us all grain brewers haven't come up with a way to employ something as simple, as that.
Yeah. And, recipes, do they even have recipes anymore? I don't know. You'd go to the homebrew store and they'd have like a bunch of pieces of paper printed out and in like a pamphlet like type holder or whatever, and you could pull out a piece of paper recipe, go buy the ingredients for it, and it was you weren't adjusting for alpha acids or anything like that. And these recipes were written for this partial volume brewing approach. And it's accounting for the gravity adjustments from adding the water. And also you're effectively over hopping it because you're then watering it down. But not, and it really served two purposes. One, stovetop brewers were limited in the size of the pot that they could physically brew with. But two, we didn't have fancy chillers back then. A lot of early homebrewers were doing a ice bath chilling method, and so by brewing a kind of more potent, smaller volume, when you add that water to your bucket or whatever, you would then not only get your fermentation volume, but you'd also assist with the temperature reduction that was very inefficient in an ice bath. And I'm sure there are many kind of older school home brewers out there that know someone, either themselves or a friend, that made the mistake of pouring the hot liquid in a glass carboy that instantly shattered in their sink before the ice bath step.
And I've actually have a friend who didn't make that mistake necessarily, but they put the hot water or the hot wort in their glass carboy, and it was fine. And I think they had done this like 5 or 6 times, and it was something on the final time. Of course, they went and made an ice bath in their like a utility sink, and they dropped the carboy down in there, and the bottom just popped off. So now they've got their ice bath is full of warm wort, because over and over again, what was happening apparently is that shock on that glass was weakening the strength of the glass, and it finally gave out. By the way, that's another huge change, a gear change is I very rarely make very strong recommendations. Don't use glass carboys. I get it. They're like old school. It makes you feel cool, like you're tapping into something unique. They are so dangerous that the amount of pictures you can find online of people who had to go to the hospital because they cut themselves, slipping on the ground or dropping a glass carboy. I don't get why anybody would opt to use that when you've got PET carboys that are excellent. When you've got, HDPE buckets are better than freaking glass carboys, and stainless steel options. It's just wild to me that anybody would choose to use glass these days. But as far as the chilling thing goes, I feel like, the up until I moved into all grain, I feel like there's a thing. Like once you go into all grain is when people start really getting deep into all of the gear stuff and really upgrading their equipment. I have to put that in air quotes because I'm not so sure everything is always an upgrade, but that's what happened for me. Is I moved into all grain, and then that's when I just went and spent way too much money on a bunch of gear. One of the things being a immersion chiller, a copper immersion chiller. And I remember at the time that I was doing that, there was this kind of move into counterflow chillers, namely plate chillers, which I believe got popular because they're sort of like heat exchangers that you find in a commercial brewery. So again, that kind of drive, that need to want to emulate the pros. I bought a plate chiller. I used it 3 times. I hated it. I hated it more than I hated any other thing that I've ever done in my brewery. So I moved away from that. I tried other counterflow chillers, but to this day, I'm still a fan of copper immersion chillers. They're efficient and easy to clean.
Well, and the other thing of the old school chilling era was you made your own copper immersion chiller, or the homebrew store sold ones that they had made, and they were always so bad looking, just disgusting. But it was a huge beginner homebrewer upgrade back then to finally graduate to an immersion chiller, because the whole watering the beer down to then partially lower the temp, and then the ice bath, which took 5 hours, and you're constantly adding new bags of ice, and you're stirring it, and you're shaking the carboy, and tying up your kitchen sink or your bathtub or whatever. The immersion chiller was such a huge upgrade 15 years ago.
The amount of laughs that I got out of friends or people online who tried to make their own copper immersion chillers and the way they come out. I mean, the best thing you can do when you mess up is post a picture online and laugh at yourself. It's hilarious. Huge thanks to Jaded Brewing for coming out with some of the most amazingly efficient immersion chillers out there. So many people, thousands of people out there I know are using Jaded Brewing. I think they're the only ones really doing anything like that these days, which is rad. And also brands like exBEERience Excelerator and all the plate chiller folks, of course, but who are making these really awesome, efficient, easy to use chillers these days. It's just made that process. To me, that was always the most laborious part of brewing. You get done, you've made your wort, everything's ready, and now it's like, ugh, I gotta wait and chill it now. To be able to be done with that in under 10 minutes is pretty sweet. So,
did we ask how people were chilling in the last homebrew survey?
I do believe it's on there. Yeah, we break down almost all of the different method pieces, and so I think most people these days are using immersion chillers. I think that's the most common way people are chilling. So, yeah, still the most popular way, I think. And there's a lot of confusion people have when it comes to something that's new. And moving into a counterflow, just the way those look and the connections, I think it looks a little intimidating, but no, they're easy. They're just as easy as an immersion chiller. You need one more hose, I believe, so not a huge issue there. So that does get us through the hot side stuff. When we come back from this break, we're going to be talking about our experiences with more modern approaches as it relates to methods on the cold side. We'll be right back.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brülosophy sent you.
Obviously, based on our prior discussion, quite a bit has changed in the way we do things on the hot side these days compared to the way we were doing things when we started. But for me, the biggest changes in my approach have actually occurred on the cold side, particularly as it relates to fermentation. You've been in this for about, 12, 13 years now, Jordan. What has changed in your not only approach, but in the way you think about fermentation, stuff on the cold side?
Everything. Back then it was a plastic bucket, a single packet of Y yeast, what was it called? 1056. And, in your closet. And that was it. You didn't even necessarily have a temperature sticker that you could read the temperature of the brew. You weren't thinking about pitch rate. You weren't thinking about injecting pure oxygen by any means. Look at us now. We're fermenting in stainless steel with glycol, chilling, and oxygen-free transfers, and proper pitch rates, and injecting pure oxygen in line. It is night and day. And I can't help but think that some of that, quote, homebrew flavor isn't just attributed to extract. It's just like not really having the best fermentation, especially given the quality of yeast we had 15 years ago.
That to me is the craziest part of, there's a lot in when it comes to fermentation that's changed for me as well, pretty much everything, but the quality of yeast, my word, in 2003, the first few batches I made, the yeast came in vials. The only company I know that ever packaged yeast in vials was White Labs. So I don't know if it was another lab who was doing that, but I think it was White Labs. And back then, if you bought a vial of yeast, you were so far ahead. You were so much more advanced than the people who were using the yeast packet that came on the bottom of the lid of liquid malt extract. Like, oh, you're fine. Just pitch that and you're going to be fine. Man, have things changed. You've got companies now who are packaging 200 billion plus cells, like Imperial Yeast. I think Guga Yeast or Giga Yeast out of the Bay Area did something similar for a while there, or they may still be doing it. But it's just crazy the thinking around yeast and the recognition of how important it is to pitch a proper amount. Now, here's the weird thing: is that as the growth and that understanding of the importance of yeast and everything that comes with it has gone up, so too has the evidence that we've shown, if you want to call that evidence or not, that's up to you, that certain factors don't seem to have the detrimental effect that many of us were convinced they did, at least when isolated, to down as best as we can get them. So it's weird because I got an email a couple of years ago from somebody who said, I find it amusing, he said, that, you guys are constantly showing that you got a glycol chiller, you got to use glycol to monitor your fermentation temperatures, you do all of these things, you got all this gear, and yet the evidence that you guys are producing shows that maybe it doesn't matter that much. Well, that in my opinion speaks to the reality that we still do the proper stuff in many ways because we want to have as much insurance that we're going to make a good beer as possible. We don't want any of those little things, arguably not so little, but on their own at least, to negatively affect the beer character. So, I may not make starters anymore, but I'm pitching, fresh imperial yeast. I may not ferment my lagers at 48 degrees Fahrenheit or 9C anymore, but I'm making sure to control the temperature at the temp that I do select. And I've done it enough times to know that I'm going to like the outcome of that. It's weird because of the shift is more in the control aspect of things and not so much what we were kind of force fed in the early days, at least for me.
Yeah. I mean, remember the packages that they used to have too? Like White Labs were in those little vials, and there was like a tablespoon of like white slurry in there,
Yeah.
And now they just increased to these kind of like modern baby food looking packages. And they're now boasting 150 billion cells in White Labs new packs. The rumor was that back in the vial era, that although they said 100, I think someone had said that they like tested a bunch and they actually only had 80 at the freshest viability. And so, back then you weren't able to get day old yeast, it'd be 4 months old and only starting at 80 billion cells. And we never would have thought about pitching 2 vials.
No,
that was just crazy.
Too expensive.
It was $10 a vial. Yeah. Yeah. And so now people have microscopes at home and, pitching by volume or by weight. We've, as a home brewing community, have definitely paid a lot more attention to that. And I think that our beers have gotten better, be it, fiddling with various variables on our own or just yeast manufacturers giving us more of the good stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And another thing, that I've seen kind of evolve up and down. It kind of had its peak and then it's already kind of coming back down. And I think we have, again, the yeast companies producing just excellent yeast for, relatively decent prices, is the whole reusing of yeast, harvesting yeast. When in my earliest of days, in 2003 up through 2005 or 6, that wasn't even something that was on my mind. I hated the fact that yeast was the most expensive part of brewing, but it was just something that you ate the cost of. You needed yeast. You're going to go to the store. You're going to buy the freshest vial you can find or the freshest pouch you can find, and you're going to use that. And then it turned into, well, you got to pitch more, so let's make yeast starters. And then people were saying, well, man, what if I could just, I'm already fermenting this clean yeast. What if I can take some of that off and reuse it in the future? And you had this huge growth of, I wrote an article on harvesting yeast from starters. People were also pulling slurry from, the bottom of their fermentation vessels and reusing that. And that was just the thing. And if you look at our survey data, our annual general homebrewer survey data, you see this trend where the harvesting of yeast is like, back in 2016, 17, everybody was doing it. And these days it has fallen off massively. I mean, again, I don't know what that is other than I think people just kind of got sick of maybe the process of harvesting yeast, but also the availability of excellent yeast these days and wanting to make different styles and not wanting to fill your fridge with a bunch of jars of yeast. It's a curious trend to witness, given how much we were behind the harvesting of yeast from starters in the beginning.
The other thing that is adjacent and related to this is that the fear of infection was really, really high when I was homebrewing. And one thing we should probably touch on is like media outlets for brewing, how that's changed. Because back when I was going, it was all about Homebrew Talk forum.
Oh, yeah.
And there was every 5 minutes a new person would post, "Is my beer infected?" And it was such a big concern back then. And I remember that the idea of yeast harvesting, they're like, "Oh, as a home brewer, you would never want to do that. You're just better off buying it because of contamination concerns. You're gonna have a lambic in a jar if you collect your own yeast from your fermentation and try to reuse it." And we kind of got over that hump and realized, no, we know how to make beer. We know how to be sanitized. We can do this, but perhaps people are just don't brew enough, or the opportunity cost isn't right, and they're just like, I'll just buy another pack for next time.
Yeah. To go on with your little aside there for a minute, man, I would have to contend. I loved Homebrew Talk in the day. I don't use it much these days for various reasons. Nothing malicious, nothing negative. It's just that I've found other outlets I prefer more, and I'm also just not spending. I don't have the time with all the editing and such that we're doing to just sit and waste time on a forum. But man, the amount of misinformation that came from Homebrew Talk, it was part of what inspired me to start doing stuff with Brülosophy, is because so many people spoke so certainly of these variables that, you just can't do this or you have to do this, that it got me going, well, what happens if I don't, or what happens if I do this thing that you say I'm not supposed to? That was a big inspiration for me. So thank you to Homebrew Talk for that. But yeah, the amount of misinformation from that forum alone has to at least match the amount of good information that was on there. I think it's probably pretty balanced. I haven't been there in a while, but I've heard from people who that's still their favorite place to go, that it has changed quite a bit, that there's a lot more, I guess, equivocalness in the way that people discuss the way they brew. But yeah, you look at like you've got subreddits now. The homebrewing subreddit really seemed to gain popularity in the last 10 years or so. You got Facebook, you've got all the various social media forums. So it has been a cool thing to see all of these different communities popping up, and all, in my experience, well, not all, but most are very welcoming. So
I actually have a funny little Homebrew Talk story I want to share real quick before we move on. So recently I was wanting some information on some sort of brewing topic. I don't remember specifically what it was, like how to use this ingredient or something like that. So I Googled it, and then there was like a 2015 or so Homebrew Talk thread that I opened up, and it had like written directions on exactly what I wanted to do. And I was like, this is great. And then I noticed the author was me. And I had come back, I'd gone to the future to teach my future self how to use whatever this ingredient was or whatever. And I was so floored because I didn't notice the username until after I relearned the process from myself.
Yeah, dude, I've had one of the funniest Homebrew Talk stories I've got since we were going to do this. We could make a whole experience episode just out of our experiences on different forums and such. But somebody emailed me and was like, oh my God, we've had a lot of threads on Homebrew Talk made posts about Brülosophy, the various things that we've done. But one of them was something along the lines of, do professionals even listen to the crap Brülosophy is putting out? Something along those lines. I didn't comment. I just went and watched the fireworks, grab my popcorn. And what was very apparent to me was that all of the people responding were homebrewers, but they were talking as if, of course not, no professional would ever do that. Meanwhile, I'm getting texts, like I found out about it from a pro brewer friend of mine who was like, hey, go get a load of this. It's pretty good stuff, So that's what I mean though, is that there's a lot of people who like to make themselves kind of feel a little bit bigger than they are, and I get that. But that's any forum you go to. I'm not dissing Homebrew Talk. I love the people over there. Again, we'll move away from that topic now and get back onto the brewing stuff. But yeah, a lot has changed in terms of where we go to get our information and our community, for homebrewing. So, in terms of, you ferment your beer, a lot has changed. We've talked about that already in terms of biggest thing for me is fermentation temperature of lagers. I know you and I aren't on the same page with that, Jordan, and that's the beauty of having personal opinions and personal preferences. But a lot has changed, and you see a lot of people these days doing things that would never have been condoned back 10, 15, 20 years ago. So another big change for me is after that beer is fermented, when I'll never forget sitting down as an older guy that homebrewed. He was a local homebrew guy that I would meet up with at, Boundary Bay Brewing, or we'd bump into each other at the homebrew shop. And he had this whole thing where it was like, a beer is going to be crap if it's clear, because that filtration is taking out all of those good flavors, which is why we homebrew. It's why there's craft breweries, or back then we called them microbreweries. And you don't want it filtered because that filtration process strips it of that wonderful aroma and flavor. I call BS. What about you, Jordan?
Well, I don't know about you, but I've never truly filtered anything, but we can use other approaches to get our beer as clear as possible. But yeah, you're right. Back in 2010 or so, craft beer microbreweries would brag about how, unfiltered. That was a big advertising pull. But I think that we've all kind of come full circle on this and realized that clear beer is the best beer, obviously. Hefeweizen and hazy IPA aside.
Yeah. So by filtration, we break it down in terms of chemical filtration and mechanical filtration. So chemical filtration, of course, is going to be your gelatin, your biofine clear, your clarity firm. I've used all of those. Mechanical filtration on the homebrew scale, you're looking at, plate filters, stuff like that. Again, on the commercial scale, they use much bigger versions of these things. We have done so many experiments on gelatin, on the different, chemical filtration. Nobody can taste a difference. I am my own worst critic. I try to hang up my bias. We know how impossible that is. In every experiment that I've performed on gelatin, the beer that didn't receive it tasted exactly the same as the one that did. And I don't care if it's bright or not. Yes, I don't tend to like super yeasty, stomach hurting beer. I'll admit that. But a little haze doesn't bother me if it's from protein or whatever. If I can make it crystal clear, I like the way it looks better. That's my thing. Maybe I'm vain. And it doesn't strip it of flavor. It doesn't strip it of aroma. I believe it was you, Jordan, recently who we were talking about the Hop Chronicles, and you maybe asked, hey, this Hop Chronicles Pale Ale isn't really clearing up. Can we throw in some gelatin? And my response was based on this. Well, we've shown over and over that gelatin doesn't matter, but there are people out there who believe it does. And just to avoid the crap slinging, we'll just not do it. It's so weird that people still believe that if you fine or filter, you're stripping flavor.
Well, but back in the day, we weren't even thinking about filtering. Homebrew was inherently kind of murky.
Yeah.
Be it a lager or a pale ale. And it's we've come a long way. Homebrews look just as beautiful as commercial beers at this point. And their taste just as good, if not better.
Without a doubt. And what I would say is that I've had homebrew beers that not only look better, they taste better, they smell better. They are just, again, personal opinion here, are just better than commercial examples. A part of that has to do with the fact that there are now umpteen million, freaking craft breweries of varying quality in the United States. We all have access to a few of them where we live most of the time. So, but homebrewers have just come so far in their ability to produce quality beers. I love it. I have used a mechanical a plate filter one time. I did it with a buddy of mine. That was more than enough to convince me never to buy one for myself, because they are messy and a pain in the butt. You end up losing like a gallon of beer. It's just not for me. I know Jake was really into his mechanical because he loves clear beer. He was really into his plate filter and did an experiment on that. And sure enough, plate filtered beer didn't taste or smell any different than one that wasn't filtered. So if you want clear beer, don't feel bad doing that. You're not risking much. I'll go to my grave saying that one. Anything else? Another interesting thing. It wasn't until I'd been brewing for like 12 years before I first cold crashed a beer. And cold crashing back then was, you take your beer, it's in the fermenter, it's got an airlock on it with some liquid, in your airlock, and you just drop the temperature all the way down to 32 degrees Fahrenheit and let it sit for 24 hours before packaging. That was such a huge thing for me because it made packaging, not clearer beer, but like less, a beer with less particulates in it so much easier. But my thinking about cold crashing has even changed since then. What about you?
Well, here's a blast from the past. Remember Suckback?
That's exactly the point I was trying to make. That's what's changed for me is that I don't want, the ambient air in my firm chamber and the gross liquid that's in the usually sanitizer, but in the airlock to get sucked back into the beer anymore. And so we've come up with even newer methods to, save us from that, I suppose.
Well, back when we were still DIYing things, remember the Brüloon? And now we just have devices built into our fermenters, or just ferment in a keg like me. You can just add gas directly onto it, so you have that constant pressure instead of like NorCal Solutions had these goofy like stage jars things that you could use to prevent suckback. And do people even use airlocks anymore? Just everything has changed.
Yeah, it's wild. I had NorCal Solutions reached out. Brülosophy was started at the time that this became a thing. And they sent me one of those things, and it was unique. It worked perfectly, just as described. And then we realized, well, why don't I just put some CO2 in a balloon and attach that in place of an airlock during the cold crash? And, and the whole point, by the way, what we're talking about is avoiding cold side oxidation. We don't want air getting into that beer because we realized that cold side oxidation really is a thing. And I'll tell you, Jordan, you might be right on the cusp of the times where it wasn't, it's always been a thing for you. When I got started, little oxidation, never hurt anybody. You just don't want to do it to a beer that's going to be aged for a long time. Boy, were we wrong. That has been something we've been able to show, particularly with hazy IPA, over and over and over again, that even a small amount of oxygen exposure can turn a beer in a matter of a week or two to, in my opinion, undrinkable.
No, I when I got started, oxidation was not a concern at all. And I remember they would also say, you're going to hear about HSA on the internet. Hot side aeration is not a thing. Don't worry about it. But cold side oxidation was definitely not something we were worried about. First off, we were mostly bottling back then, and I think that actually early home brewers that were bottling with bottling sugar, there actually is less oxidation concern because you have the benefit of that oxygen scavenging, scrubbing effect of the re-fermentation in the bottle. But once we started moving into kegging, you just opened the keg up and racked it in with a plastic racking cane that was racking to the bottom, to kind of like not let it splash too much, but purging, etc. We weren't doing anything like that. And I cannot imagine how oxidized my beers must have been, 10 years ago.
I'll tell you though, man, my experience with that, because I did the same thing. You just open the keg. I wasn't purging the kegs. I literally took a piece of tubing that was halfway down my keg and it just kind of hung in there, and the beer just splashed into the keg until it was full. I made a lot of beers that I swear didn't have that cold side oxidation character that we get from hazy IPA. There was a few styles where I'd be like, what in the world is going on? Whenever I make a Kolsch, for example, that was one where I was like, why is the end of the keg? Why does this beer look purple? And now I know with a fair degree of confidence that was oxidation, that's what was happening. And, the experience for me was I moved to kegging so that I could drink my beer faster. And we could go on forever about the different carbonation practices and all of that, from low and slow to shake it, the whole shake, rattle and roll thing. And then now we got burst carbonation and, people using carbonation stones, which don't do that. Not worth it. All that kind of stuff. But the whole idea there was we want to drink this beer sooner. So I think the issue was that we were drinking our beer so fast that maybe I missed, we missed that window of oxidation, thankfully. And so our beers are fine. With the hazy IPA thing and how sensitive that style seems to be to oxidation, I think most of us are just practicing, low cold side oxidation practices all the time, just again as a bit of insurance. And I'm so glad that I made that change, because the beers did improve in quality in my experience.
I think also is that we didn't necessarily have the palate for slight levels of oxidation or the tolerance or lack thereof that we have now. Now it's like a little bit, it's just like, it's not quite right, because we're making such great beer now. I think the standards were just a little lower back then because we didn't know any better. I also kind of wonder, like, the rise of all-in-ones and all grain being a really popular first brew method. I also kind of wonder, like, how common kegging is now, because when I was homebrewing, kegging was like super advanced. Like, you had to be like a retired dad that had like the space and the energy and the time. It was like not like a very realistic scenario to be kegging your own beer at home when I first got it started. And now it's like no one's bottling.
Yeah. Oh, I still know a few people who bottle, but they do it in addition to kegging. They do it for, I think you did it, right?
Same.
For like yeah. And it's become a thing that you do for specific styles or for specific reasons. If you really want a high carbonation, it can be kind of difficult to do that in a keg without getting a glass of foam. But if you have the right bottles, you can do it. One of the things when it comes to bottle conditioning that I find fascinating, the shift. Do you recall if you were to go to Homebrew Talk, let's say, and you know what, I forgot to pick up priming sugar at the homebrew shop. Is there anything else I can use? Can I just use table sugar? Oh my God, out of the woodwork. No way, don't do that. The beer's gonna taste like cider. Despite the fact that you are literally using like a quarter teaspoon of sugar per bottle when you stretch it out, that's gonna completely ruin the beer and make it taste like green apple or cider or whatever. Dude, that we have shown again through our experiments over and over, making beers with big chunks of either of those sugars doesn't change the flavor of the beer, certainly doesn't have a negative impact or ruin it.
Right. And, another thing you used to hear about back in the day was people priming with DME.
Oh, yeah.
And that seems to kind of fallen out of favor, too.
I think it's messy and more expensive than sugar, so people don't do it. A lot of newer homebrewers, there used to be a joke that have a new homebrewer create a recipe and you're gonna have to go to the homebrew store and buy 15 ingredients. I get it. People love that part of it. It's the creative piece of brewing. But one of the things that a lot of newer homebrewers were doing was, I'll just bottle condition or prime my bottles with maple syrup, and that's going to contribute a nice flavor, or, use honey or something like that. And again, the amount that you need to achieve carbonation is so low that the beers that I've seen, I've never done it, but my brother used to do it when he was bottle conditioning. And, you don't really taste the maple. You don't really taste the honey. I think you can convince yourself it's there. We have a tendency to do that. But just if I was bottle conditioning, I would just use table sugar because it's always at my house, Yeah,
it's cheap, it's easy, it's there. And it's probably a lot of Belgian brewers are using it. So if it's good for them, it's good enough for us.
Exactly. Any other differences that you can think of in the way that you think about packaging, carbonating, all that kind of stuff in the early days compared to today?
Well, I will say that the first few times I kegged my first few beers, carbonation was such a nightmare. It's flat. All of a sudden it's overcarbed, but it's pouring flat. And I think that we understand that a lot better. And I revisit the Brülosophy carbonation methods page all the time. That's got to be one of the most visited pages on the website.
It's a popular one, the Sparkle and Fizz one. Yeah, it's and the beauty of that is that it's based largely on our collective experiences as contributors who are brewing a ton and trying to turn these beers around fast. But also, the input of a lot of respected homebrewers out there, names that most people are aware of. It's the fact that you can turn a beer. I mean, I think that's the big thing, right? Back when I started brewing, there it is again. When I first started brewing, though, it was expected that a beer is going to take you 3 to 4 weeks from start to finish, right? The grain to glass. I've made a beer in 7 days. You make a nice low ABV warm fermented saison. It ferments out in 4 or 5 days. You cold crash it. You burst carb it. You're drinking it a week later. It's phenomenal what we've been able to do with this crazy impatience that we all seem to share.
Right. I'm just really glad I'm not like cranking and shaking anymore. Like there's better ways we can do this quickly.
Yeah, that's actually how I'd never heard of the burst carbonation thing. And that wasn't even a term that I came up with. Somebody else, when I first shared on some forum somewhere that I'm going to go 50 PSI for 15 hours and see what happens. Somebody just kind of used that term and it stuck. But the idea for that came from, I was hanging out with my friend Tommy Caprellian from House of Pendragon. We were in his brewery and he pulled off a sample of a Schwartz beer. And he said, yeah, I kegged this up yesterday. It's in the Bright tank. I racked it to Bright yesterday. And I was like, how's it already carbonated? Oh, we do high pressure for a limited amount of time before kegging it off. And I was like, well, why can't we do that? We've got these kegs that hold a lot of pressure. And, was it 7, 8 years ago is when I started doing that. And I don't see any reason to do it any other way. I get it. If you need to take a keg to a party and you forgot to hit it with gas the night before, yeah, go 60 PSI and shake that thing for 5 minutes. You'll get carbonation. I've just found it to be, like you said, wildly unpredictable. And usually doesn't have that same feel to me as when I burst carbonate.
Yeah, too risky. The burst carb is the way to go. And these days I'm doing kind of like 30 PSI for a couple days and dial it back a little bit to like 18 or so. And just like, it gets there. And because like low and slow, it's like, it would just never, ever take, they say a week or two, and it's like, maybe lagering for a month under 12 PSI will get you there. But I just hadn't had a lot of success with that super low and slow approach.
Yeah, I've done it a few times, but I don't go 12 PSI. So 12 to 14 PSI, I think is pretty standard serving pressure. In my experience, you got to bump it up to like 18 or 20. And at that point, you're just doing a shorter, or I guess a more extended burst carb. So there is kind of that in between, but it does take some time. The very first lagers that I ever made, this was before I was a heretic. When I was fermenting, pitching at 46, fermenting at 48, letting them lager for 6-7 weeks, whatever it was. For those ones, I didn't burst carb because I was lagering them in the serving keg in my chest freezer, my Keyser, and so they just kind of sat there for 6 weeks, and they would be perfectly carbonated by the time I got to them. But if I'm looking for a quick turnaround ale, or even a quick turnaround lager these days, I'm just hitting it with 50 PSI for 12 hours and then knocking it down to 18 like you and letting it sit. And I'll start drinking it right away. Because of gelatin and because of racking processes, I usually end up with beers that have very little sediment at the bottom of the keg. And I think that's awesome. So that covers most of like the method technique stuff. We hit a little bit on some offshoot stuff, but is there anything else that you feel is really kind of evolved since you started brewing and where we're at today that maybe is outside of the realm of approach, of methodology?
Well, it's definitely methods adjacent as styles. When I got started, amber ales, brown ales, porters, West Coast versus hazy IPA wasn't a thing yet. It was just called IPA. It seems that we have a lot of new styles that people are brewing, like the West Coast Pilsner or something like that just weren't a thing back then. And then a lot of styles that were really popular have kind of fallen off the radar, like red ale and things like that.
Yeah, dude, that was when I started. One of the big drivers for me wanting to brew wasn't to make IPA. I mean, that's what everybody was getting into in the early 2000s. But IPA back then, especially in the PNW, Pacific Northwest, was just bitter bombs. They were like pine tree bitter bombs that I loved. But what really got me going was, I don't know if you've ever had it. You live in Portland, so probably was Mac and Jack's African Amber. Mm-hmm. I wanted to make something like that at home. And it's part of the reason my first beer was an Irish Red Ale, because I was told, well, that was kind of the precursor to American Amber Ale. And I still love the style. I've brewed so many different versions of Amber Ale. But yeah, even that style, which was huge 20 years ago, where's it at now? Very rarely do you go to a homebrew meetup and have somebody serve you a classic American Amber Ale. It's fascinating that shift. What you are always going to find though is hazy IPA. That wasn't even a thing. Hazy IPA 20 years ago was an IPA that the brewer didn't make very well. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. And in my opinion, maybe that's still the case, but that's just a personal style bias. But are there any styles that have come and gone in the last 10 years? I think brewed IPA sticks out, as well as kind of, there was like a little fascination with, quote, Norwegian farmhouse ales that kind of blew over, I think, as well. Any others that you've seen come and go quickly?
I think there's been myriad different, off-spin, offshoot IPAs, white IPA, brown IPA. I mean, people are still making those, but they're just not that popular. One that really I find fascinating, and that, being from the Pacific Northwest like you, the whole Cascadian Dark Ale or Black IPA, that got popular enough to where commercial breweries were making excellent examples of it. Firestone Walker made one that was phenomenal. I still love it. Now they release it seasonally, but they had it around a lot back in the day. Ruination from Stone. Now where is it? I mean, it's basically a non-style nowadays. People just aren't really into it anymore. And I don't know if that's because of just kind of the general moving away from this lull that we're in right now, or if it's because people got interested in newer versions of IPA, cold IPA, which I already see a downward trend on that style as well. I don't know, but it's interesting to watch these things coming and going. The beautiful thing is that they will always be in the annals of our brewing history thanks to the BJCP kind of including them in their updates, you know?
Yeah. 100 years from now, people are going to be recreating a historic black IPA.
Originally brewed, in San Diego, California, the barren beer desert these days. We'll see. It's going to be interesting. Some things that I would say that I've noticed some rather big changes in that don't really have to do with methodology. One of them are kind of the general thoughts about big beer. I know that this is still a thing among some people out there that they just absolutely abhor, Budweiser, Miller, and Coors for, the bad business practices. And if you buy anything from them, that's money that you're taking away from. I feel like, again, for various reasons, that has softened up a bit. When you've got legitimate craft brewing publications, publishing articles about what, beer do brewers drink when they're not drinking their own, and it's widely Coors Light, Miller Lite, Coors Banquet. I think that's pretty cool, and it shows that, like, hey, look, we're not as entitled as we've acted in the past. That doesn't mean you have to like it. It doesn't mean you have to support big beer, but the fact that we're just not hung up on it, that it's not something we're overly focusing on anymore, is something I've liked quite a bit.
And I think it coincides with the lager renaissance that we're experiencing right now. When you and me got started in homebrewing, it was like lagers. One, we don't do that because we're brewing home ales at home because we don't want to drink lagers.
That's right.
And then two, you can't do it. You just can't do it at home level. It's not possible. And then microbreweries made ale. They didn't make lager. And there was like the whole unfiltered philosophy. Ale brewing was like shaking your fist in the air at the big brewer. But we've realized lagers are actually pretty awesome beverages, and we can make those at home, and we can make those in small craft breweries. And so now lager is not out of reach. Small breweries and home brewers are making amazing lager. And I think it's kind of like help us come full circle and being okay with big beer again.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think, all of that kind of speaks to the wider just coolness of the brewing community these days. There used to be so much sanctimony wrapped up in this hobby and in this industry, really, where, if you were a home brewer, boy, you had something above those people who just go to the store and buy their beer. I've liked seeing that kind of fade away, that arrogance is gone. And I speak pretty openly about it. I'm not saying that I never was that way. I have a feeling that I came across that way quite often when, new brewers would ask me something, and I was the first one to say, well, are you making starters? Is that what if you're not, you're making shit beer. We're not there anymore. I think there's a more helpful nature in general that hopefully that's the way it is in other, communities. But where I'm at and the people that I talk to and I commune with, it really is much more open arms and accepting and more helpful than it is derogatory. And there's still those people out there. Some of those people take our surveys. We hear you, we see you. But I like to see that we're moving away from that. We're not better than anybody because we make our own beer. Our beer might be better than some. I mean, I'll stick with that. But I think a part of keeping this hobby alive and going is loosening up some of that crap, and anyways, being cooler with other people. So.
Yeah, well, I think that we have the coolest community on the planet, and I can't not be, more proud to be a member of it.
Amen to that. And Jordan, that brings us to the end of this episode. Do you have any final words on your experiences brewing in the modern age before we kick this can?
It's interesting to ponder what the future might hold, and I'm excited to see it.
That's exactly what I have in my notes we're here after, for me, 20 years, for you after, 14 years or whatever it might be. And imagine where we're going to be in another 15, 20 years. It just blows my mind to think of what could possibly change in that time. So, well, don't forget to check out our other podcast, The Brew Lab, where host Kate Job takes you into the lab with brewing experts to discuss the fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And remember to head over to brewlosophy.com to stay current on everything we are up to.
The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no